Good morning, distinguished guests and social work researchers. I'm Shenyang, Vice President of SSWR and a professor at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce our featured speakers and moderate today's session, which will discuss fundamental issues concerning social justice and science. Our conference theme, Social Work Science for Racial, Social, and Political Justice, recognize an underlying value that has long driven our profession, and it makes explicit our commitment to upholding racial, social, and political justice. And in practice, including research related to public policies and social interventions. Eradicating racism, alleviating poverty and economic inequality, enhancing social inclusion, and fighting the coronavirus pandemic require a continuous pursuit of this strongly embedded value that defines social work and that motivates us for the scientific enterprise. In a time of social fracturing and pivotal political discussion, it has never been more important to advance science and social justice in the public interest. To meet this goal, the SSWR Conference Planning Committee invited two eminent scholars, Drs. Holden Thorp and Louis Zayas, to discuss today key challenges and strategies regarding science and justice, particularly how to create a vibrant and a foundational public record that demonstrates the relevance of science for advancing equity during chaos. Over more than 100 years of social work history, Dr. Holden Thorp is the only and the very first speaker of a top leader of Science magazine to give us a talk. We really appreciate this unique opportunity to listen to his opinions and listen to the dialogue between two great scholars on critical issues at this very critical time. When Dr. Thorp became the editor-in-chief of Science in October 2019, he wasn't planning to write editorials challenging the US president during an international crisis. However, as the pandemic began to unfold, Dr. Thorp was triggered by Donald Trump's inaccurate and irresponsible statements about the prevention and treatment of COVID-19 disease, including the development of vaccines. Dr. Thorp then published a series of editorials, 19 of them as of December 2021, to speak up for science and the urgency of promoting social, racial, and political justice during chaos. In today's symposium, Dr. Zayas will interview Dr. Thorp and discuss critical themes in his editorials and the implications of his writings for social work science and practice. Before I introduce our featured speakers, I must acknowledge a key scholar, Dr. David T. Takeuchi, who helped design this symposium and made great contributions to today's session. Dr. Takeuchi is professor and associate dean for faculty excellence at the School of Social Work at the University of Washington in Seattle. He is a distinguished scholar in our field. His work on the social, structural, and cultural contexts that are associated with health outcomes, especially among racial and ethnic minorities, makes great impacts on social work research as well as our society. Because of the surge of COVID-19, Dr. Takeuchi decided not to join us in person in this conference. Now it's my great honor to introduce our featured speakers. Dr. Holden Thorp became editor-in-chief of Science of the Science family of journals on October 28, 2019. He came to Science from Washington University in St. Louis, where he was the provost from 2013 to 2019, and where he was the Rita Levi Montalcini Distinguished University Professor. He held appointments in both chemistry and medicine. Dr. Thorp joined Washington University after spending 3 decades at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, UNC. There, he served as the 10th chancellor from 2008 through 2013. A North Carolina native, Dr. Thorp started at UNC as an undergraduate student and earned a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry in 1986. He earned a doctorate in chemistry in 1989 at the California Institute of Technology. Working with Harry B. Gray in organic photochemistry, he completed postdoctoral work at Yale University, working on model compounds in Yale's Photosynthetic Reaction Center. He holds an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from North Carolina Wesleyan College and is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Inventors, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In his research career, Dr. Thorp studied electron transfer reactions of nucleic acids, developing technology for electronic DNA chips. He co-founded Vimet Pharmaceuticals, which developed oteseconazole, sorry about my pronunciation, oteseconazole, is now held by Mycovia Pharmaceuticals. Dr. Thorp is a venture partner at Hatteras Venture Partners, a consultant to Ancora, and is on the board of directors of the College Advising Corps and Artisan Biosciences. Dr. Thorp is widely published. He is the co-author with Buck Goldstein of 2 books on higher education: Engine of Innovation, the Entrepreneurial University in the 21st Century, and Our Higher Calling, Rebuilding the Partnership Between America and its Colleges and Universities, both from UNC Press. Over his career, he has published many scientific articles, including more than 40 editorials of science on topics such as the importance of science and scientific findings in public policy and political discourse. Dr. Luis Zayas is presently Dean of the Steve Hicks School of Social Work at the University of Texas. He holds the Robert Lee Sutherland Chair in Mental Health and Social Policy at Texas, and he is also Professor of Psychiatry in the Dell Medical School of the University of Texas. Luis is finishing his term as president of SSWR this year. Now, please join me in welcoming Drs. Thorp and Zayas to discuss dispatches from the pandemic, creating an accurate scientific record, and speaking up for science and equity during chaos.
Well, thank you very much, Shenyang, for that lovely introduction. And I asked Shenyang to make my introduction brief.
I'll send a shorter one.
But anyways, I want to be able to use as much time as we can to ask Dr. Thorp a few questions. Perhaps the best way to start is to tell us something about science and the family of journals, as it's called, and say something about it, its role among scientific journals, and what how you think it should be positioned as a major journal.
Thanks a lot, and Shenyang, thank you for that wonderful introduction and for being such a great colleague. There are a few people who I've had the opportunity to serve as both their chancellor and their provost. You happen to be in that group, and it's been an honor at both places. So thanks for all you do for social science and for social work. I have a very important relationship with social work because not only were my colleagues at WashU and UNC two great social work schools, some of my favorite colleagues, but my daughter is partway to her MSW at the Brown School. So social work is very important to the Thorp family. So I have the privilege of being the editor-in-chief of Science, which is unusual scientific journal, to say the least. The parent journal, Science, is really three journals. We have news, and we have a news division of 30 or more science journalists all over the world who bring science journalism in a way that very few places can do. As we all know, journalism is very hard to finance in today's world. We basically use research to subsidize it, and proud to do so. The research part of the journal, which is one of the most selective and highly cited research journals, covering everything from social work all the way to quantum computing. It's really a privilege to see just the range of things that we're able to cover. It's quite selective. We only take 7% of what gets submitted to us, and things are typically very highly cited if they're published in our journal. You may want to ask me about all that depending on what we get to today. And we have a team of people who help us pitch all of our scientific articles to the media. So one of the things that folks expect when they publish in Science is that there's a good chance that NPR, the NewsHour, or one of the major national newspapers is going to cover their paper. And we work hard at trying to make sure that that can happen for our authors. And then the third section of the journal is what we call Insights, and we think of that as the best place in the world for scientists to talk to each other about science. That includes our editorials, as Shenyang was saying, but also we have policy forums, which have a lot of content that would be relevant to your group, and then other book reviews and other kinds of content where scientists are writing about other research and debating things. Then there are 5 more journals that are much more traditional scholarly journals, mostly in the life sciences, but we have Science Robotics, and then we have Science Advances, which also, like Science, covers pretty much everything, and it's an open access journal. It takes 160 people to do this. We used to do it 3 blocks from here at the corner of 12th and H. Now we just walk by the building and remember what it was like to work in there. And we're pretty distributed now around the world with our editors, and more than likely it'll mostly stay that way from here on.
Well, thank you very much. And I think it's a It's a good way to understand the journal and your role. And we have referred to editorials, so I'm going to jump right into
Sure.
those, okay? So before you assumed the role of editor-in-chief, you wanted Science to have a bolder editorial voice than in the past. So the question is, what do you mean by bolder, and what did you see that wasn't bold enough in Science, and what led you to create the vision that you wanted to? What was happening that you thought
Right.
it really needed
Well,
to be bolder?
before the pandemic, when Alan Leshner, who was the CEO of the AAAS, hired me, he said, I want you to make the editorials edgier. I can't remember the precise word he used. And there's a good reason for it, because you think about it, your president works for Greg Abbott. So there's not a whole lot of stuff that he can say, even if he wanted to. Shenyang's president works for the titans of industry in St. Louis, people who really care about the city and the university, but they probably, don't necessarily agree with us about everything. I work for a board full of other academic scientists. So if I'm not going to be the one to speak out, who will? I have zero professional risk because the people that I work for are people who agree with me about stuff, which is something that a lot of other leaders in science and academia don't have the luxury of being able to do. So, I did even at the beginning see that there was an opportunity to build a stronger voice for science. And over the years, there has been. Marcia McNutt was very outspoken about climate change, and Don Kennedy was during the George W. Bush administration, and he was pretty outspoken about his views. And so that was the plan, and we had no idea a global pandemic was going to come along and create the opportunity to speak for science that we have. And I view my role, look, it doesn't influence public policy very much. During the Trump administration, Kayleigh McEnany didn't print out my editorials and stick them on the Resolute desk and say, hey, boss, you probably ought to read this. My role is really to reassure the scientific community that there's somebody out there who feels what they're going through and is supporting them. So, early in the pandemic, I used to imagine, all right, here's somebody, she's got little kids at home, her husband's work situation is compromised by the pandemic, she's got an ill parent, but she's still trudging into the lab 14 hours a day to work on the vaccine or the description of the virus. She comes home, she turns the news on, she sees her president undermining everything she's doing. What does she want her journal to say about that? That's my rubric. Yeah.
And it's a rubric that's worth adopting by many journals. I think we need to address the social justice. So the pandemic hits. All right, and in February 2020, your first editorial on the pandemic was titled "The Costs of Secrecy." In it, you call for China to be more transparent in their research on the SARS and to more openly share their data. The editorial came pretty early, in the pandemic when the general public was just learning about this thing called COVID-19. Can you give us a gist of that first editorial and what led you to write it? What was the time like?
So, just to put it in context, we're working in our building 3 blocks from here. Val DeVinson, who does structural biology for us, comes in and she says, "Great news, I got the structure of the spike protein." I said, "Wonderful, what's the spike protein?" Just to put in perspective kind of how we were learning all of this on the fly. We did publish the structure of the spike protein, and it's been cited something like 3,500 times in 2 years. And hopefully those authors will get a Nobel Prize eventually. So we're watching the pandemic unfold, and at that point, it wasn't so clear whether it was going to come to the U.S. or not. I mean, it seemed likely, but it wasn't a certainty. And so I was writing about the fact that the Chinese government had, and I think it's now quite clear that this is still true, covering up the origin of the virus, not where it came from. We can talk about that if you want to, but just about the fact that there was a virus circulating there that had the potential to cause a global pandemic. Saying that because they waited to share the sequence and just share everything about how the virus was spreading, that was setting things back. There was a prophetic comment in there which said, will Western governments do any better? We don't know. Only a few weeks later, we did know the answer to that, and the answer was no better. But, if I'm going to criticize and with China, it's very complicated because of the politics there, and the relationship with the government is different than it is here. But basically, my view is, if I'm going to criticize the U.S. government, then I'm going to criticize the Chinese government. If I'm going to criticize Donald Trump, I'm not wild about everything that Joe Biden is doing, and I've been writing about that too. I'm here to speak up for science. That's it. That was kind of the beginning. My colleagues were nervous when we decided to run that piece. It was definitely one of the most aggressive editorials ever, but it was nothing compared to what came later. But that's kind of where we started breaking through the curtain, I guess.
Sure. I have another question. I want Shenyang also to join in. Then in March, you turned your sights on the U.S. government, which you just alluded to, including President Trump. Do me a favor, which parodies the words he uses as a New Yorker. His "do me a favor" to the pharmaceutical companies to speed up the development of the vaccine. What was the reception like at the time? At a time when the president was in office, and you're parodying him with "do me a favor."
Yeah. So that was by far the most that our journal had ever just overtly taken on the president of the United States. The tradition, there's kind of a Washington tradition that in a journal like ours, you always just say the administration.
Yeah.
I had written a piece earlier about the EPA transparency rule, which the Republicans were gutting, and I wrote it and said Donald Trump, and everybody said, no, let's change it to the administration. But then when we got to him tweeting that this was just the flu and everybody should go about their business, I just told everyone, okay, we're done with this whole administration deal. And so that was actually the first time that the U.S. president's name had been used in a science editorial. And it was tough. We wrote it up. And my editor and I were on the phone late the night before we posted it. And I said, should we do this? She said, we don't have any choice. And so we posted it the next day. And we know just based on the data that we have that 1 million people downloaded that editorial, not including, it was reprinted in a lot of other newspapers, and of course, you all know scientific journals don't exactly get everybody to read their content on their website. So millions of people read that piece, and it really began the era of us, and then the New England Journal of Medicine, and then Nature, beginning to take on the administration in a way that really hadn't happened in the history of scientific publishing.
Yeah. Shenyang is getting ready for a question, but let me jump in here a second. And that is, at the time Donald Trump was receiving, or had around him some medical advisors who seemed to be pretty docile in their approach to him. As we recall, they would sit in the briefing room and sometimes horrified at the things he said. What was the scientific community's take on those individuals and their roles, or their failure to act and to step up?
Right. I mean, I think it's a classic story, and it plays out in higher education all the time. You have you have university presidents in red states. Do they take on the government and get fired, or do they live to fight another day, to take on another battle? They're wrestling with that every day. I wrestled with that when I was in North Carolina. It's brutal. And I think that Tony Fauci and Deborah Birx were in the same boat. I mean, now a lot of email has come out that showed, of course, they were not happy with the things that Peter Navarro and Donald Trump and and Scott Atlas were doing. And they every day had to decide, do I do what Rick Bright did and fall on the sword to expose this, or do I do the best I can to stay here and try to do as much good as I can? I think on balance we're probably better off that they hung in there. But they're going to have a lot of sleepless nights the rest of their lives staring at the ceiling. And, I hate that for them because they're both outstanding public servants. Yeah.
Thank you. We would imagine that another article you did probably caused a controversy. That one was published on September 18, 2020, entitled "Trump Lied About Science." Tell us a little bit more about the thinking and the decision behind the editorial, and what was the reaction from your membership and other constituents?
Yeah, so I live 10 blocks to the west, exactly 1 mile north of the Lincoln Memorial. I was going for, all the gyms were closed then, so I was going for a walk around the mall. And I was listening to the news and listening to Donald Trump, the recordings that Bob Woodward had made of Donald Trump in March of 2020, showing clearly that he lied about what he knew about the pandemic. And so when I got back to my apartment and sat down at my dining room table where I've done most of this stuff, I just typed the words "Trump lied about science." That was the title. The rest of it wrote itself. And, we ran it the next day or the day after, and it did induce a pretty strong reaction, including something that probably had never happened in the history of the magazine, which is the White House issued a statement saying that the editor-in-chief was incorrect and Donald Trump would never lie to the American people. That's just boilerplate for them. But I never expected I would get a statement from the White House for something that I wrote, when I was an assistant professor or something like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, may I follow up? There can be lies, right? And there are people who are liars. And then there are those who receive the lies and either question them or believe them. Mm-hmm. And it seems that the words that Trump would utter would be received by many as truth. It says something about our country that we have that. Reminds me, and this is not new, it does bring me back to Richard Hostetler, I believe that's his name, who wrote Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. It won the Pulitzer Prize back in 1959. Mm-hmm. His first chapter is about how anti-intellectual this country is. I mean, all you need to do is read that one chapter and you can appreciate. It hasn't changed, it seems. The fact that lies like this are received and believed and no one questions. Tell me what your thoughts are on the American public's willingness to take in those lies, let's call them what they are,
yeah,
and then believe them.
Yeah, so that's the realm of you all. Yep. And that's why, we and not every, cancer biologist agrees that we should be publishing social science in the journal. But we view social science is science. I expect everybody here and everyone on the screen agrees with that. And that the interaction of science and social science is absolutely vital. I mean, forget the pandemic for a second. Everything related to the social determinants of health, the way that algorithms are used to sort folks into healthcare, all kinds of things about how we absorb culture. There's so much that's vital about the interaction of the natural sciences and the social sciences that we're just deeply committed to. And this is a huge part of the reason why. Because if you think about what happened in the pandemic, well, the people with the pipettes in their hand did about as well as they could. I mean, we got the vaccines fast. We know everything there is to know about this virus. Not everybody listened to us, but we knew the variants were coming. We knew this was going to be years. We published all that stuff, but very little of that got through. It got through to a few other scientists, but it certainly didn't get through to the American public. And there's so many different pockets of people out there who have been affected by this. I mean, it's easy to sit in Washington, D.C. and think that everybody who doesn't want to get a vaccine is glued to Fox News. But guess what? Not everybody are news junkies like we are. I mean, I spent most of the pandemic in Orlando, Florida, where I've always had a little place to get away from the St. Louis winters. And my next door neighbors are wonderful people, and they believe the same things about politics that I do, but they're not glued to the TV all the time. And so they're not vaccinated. They just don't think about it like we do. And that's the kind of thing that what you all do is designed to figure out. And other communities that haven't been treated fairly by science. It makes sense that they wouldn't know whether to get the vaccine or not. And then, of course, there is how do you get the people who have been brainwashed to pay attention to this? And for sure, as I always say, people ask me, how do I get my climate-denying uncle to believe in climate change? And I tell them, well, I don't know, but I can tell you one way that wouldn't work, and that's to print out all my editorials and hand them to him. I don't write my editorials for your climate-denying uncle. I write my editorials for other scientists. And so the people who really study this, and I talk to a lot of them, and I guess, somebody that I really respect in this field is Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who's a faculty member at Penn in communications. Scientists do a lousy job of thinking about how our messages are going to be received. Let's just take masks. So we decided the expression was masks work. Well, masks help, but they don't absolutely prevent you from getting infected. So when you say masks work, somebody who wants to challenge you, all they have to do is put their mask on, and they go to church and they get COVID, and they say, see, masks don't work. Well, if we'd said masks help instead of masks work, we wouldn't be subject to being manipulated the way that we've been manipulated. And if you look at, for example, with vaccination, well, look, we were all hoping that vaccination would give you sterilizing immunity like it does with the mumps. But actually we knew. I mean, the flu shot doesn't do that. That's a respiratory virus. So why did we think, I mean, it was wishful thinking, hopeful, to think that once everybody got 2 shots that we were going to be done with the pandemic, but we had tons of science that suggested, for decades that wasn't right. We got all excited about that. And of course, then when the harsh reality that the vaccines prevent severe disease and hospitalization, but they don't necessarily prevent you from getting a breakthrough infection, came along, we didn't look as credible as we could have. So, and then I think there's just the whole way that social media has come up that we haven't fought back against. The anger industrial complex is quite powerful. Ben Shapiro and Dan Bongino have 20 times the wattage of the New York Times. We don't see that because the New York Times is what we read. But out there in Texas and Missouri, the Dan Bongino's got a lot more influence than the New York Times does. Yeah.
Oh, no, go ahead if you had. Okay.
One of your editorial strategies, even in your criticism of the US government and Trump's handling of the pandemic, is to frame an issue around protecting the good and the well-being of science. While this may have been an effective strategy in the beginning, it has become increasingly more difficult to frame issues just within a scientific framework. Witness how vaccinations became a political issue. Do you see the intrusion of politics within science as lasting? There are actions we can take to remove politics from the science, or is this inevitable for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, so as Luis was just saying, I mean, this is not a new thing. It's been sort of industrialized and weaponized in a way that is new. But science and politics have been mixed up with each other for really forever, but or as long as we've had both things. But especially in the United States since 1945, when Vannevar Bush wrote his paper, Science, the Endless Frontier, which was the political case for the federal support of science. If you read Bush's paper, it is in every way a political document. And I always tell people, a lot of you, everyone in the audience, lots of academics come to Washington to work on some commission that's going to write some report, and people wonder if it's going to be read. And I always say, well, you never know when you're going to write Science, the Endless Frontier. So you got to keep writing these things because some of them become very influential, and none more influential than that. And if you read that document, it is absolutely an act of political persuasion. It happens to argue for academic freedom and curiosity-driven research, and so a lot of people wave it around and say this is this pure document that supports scientific inquiry. But if you read the arguments that Bush makes, the 3 arguments that he makes are the war on disease, having a vibrant economy, and building up defense. It's an absolute neoliberal argument for why science is important. It's instrumentalist through and through. There's nothing in there about, there's a few passing statements about the beauty of knowledge, and there's a little thing in there about the social science and the humanities that kind of got thrown in, but it was well known that Vannevar Bush was not a fan of the humanities and the social sciences. So, that is extremely political. I mean, it's political, it's nationalistic. If you watch the hearings, even now, for when people go to argue for science funding, and my boss sued at Parikh and Francis Collins and all these Ponch, all these folks are sitting there. What are they saying? Well, they're saying we need to have a strong science funding infrastructure in the United States so that we can compete with China. And before that, they said, their predecessors said, we need the same thing so that we can compete with Russia. And in 1945, Vannevar Bush said, we need this so that we can compete with Germany and Japan. So we have had a nationalistic science infrastructure in the United States for as long as we have had federal science. So to say that it's not political, it's never been not political. It's always been political. And then you get into how it's manipulated. Certainly it's true that the Republicans have figured out that they can change scientific facts to their political advantage. A lot of people, historians, would say that when this really took off was kind of in the transition from Barry Goldwater to Ronald Reagan. Barry Goldwater was an ardent environmentalist. And Ronald Reagan figured out that arguing against the environment was politically useful. Why? Because he had much more sophisticated tools for political polling and analyzing political data. So suddenly the Republican Party decided they weren't for the environment anymore, even though Richard Nixon and Goldwater had been ardent environmentalists. So that's really when we began the sort of climate denying, was in the 80s. And then over the years that has happened, but it's the Democrats, while there's certainly not a moral equivalence at all. I mean, right now, they're basically, their strategy is pretty clearly, we want to vaccinate everybody, but we want to keep everything open, even though we've got a bunch of vulnerable people who really ought to be protected more. And that's not their strategy, right? And even though a year ago they were standing in front of all these banners that said, the people have chosen science. Well, the science says now, we ought to tough it out a little while longer. And it's clear that Jeff Zients and the CDC director, that their strategy is, the polling must say that it's really good to say we're for vaccination, but we're not for social distancing. And that's the strategy we're seeing now. So it's always been political. There's to pretend like it's not is denial, and that is a large part of how science has allowed ourselves to be manipulated. Because we think, oh, we're these objective automatons who stare at our spreadsheets and everything we conclude is perfectly rational. But we're political beings with political feelings, and we're fallible, and we're subject to motivated reasoning and all the same things that every human being is subject to. And we need to be, to me, that's what makes it fascinating to write about it. And in my opinion, we shouldn't run away from that.
The arguments for science have been so that we can address external enemies. So whether it was Russia, Germany, and Japan in the past, and now China, it hasn't addressed the internal threats, which are poverty, racism, discrimination, inaccessible health care. How do we turn the corner on that so that what's happening here, that our young black men are being killed at rates that supersede any other group, that police brutality happens every day to communities of color. How do we turn, it's political, right? Science is political. How do we turn that to work for us? I mean, this is a a group of social workers you're talking to, and our interests are racial, social, and economic and political justice. So how do we get those leaders to turn inward and look at what's happening here?
Well, I think the first thing is we have to start internally. We cover all these topics, both in science and even more so in science advances. Not everybody agrees. We get a lot of mail when we publish these papers saying, why don't you stick to science? And we write back and say, we are sticking to science. This is science. Racism, police brutality, poverty, these things can all be measured quantitatively. That's what you all do. They can be subjected to the same rigorous statistical analysis as gene expression and quantum mechanics can be. And so the first thing is we have to get our own act together amongst each other. And I commend you for, that's probably the first time electron transfer reactions of nucleic acids have been mentioned at this conference.
I don't know, it happens all the time.
Yeah, okay. We need to go to hardcore science conferences and mention poverty and racism and health disparities, because we've all got a lot to learn from each other. I mean, obviously, we didn't achieve what we wanted to achieve in the pandemic because we did well at science, but not social science. And so first things first, and I've been writing a lot about this and will more in the future, we've got to get the world of science together, which includes science and social science. We recently signed up Jennifer Lee to write for us about issues related to Asian American and Asian discrimination and sociology. She's a sociologist at Columbia. We're going to sign up more folks like that and hope that the biologists and the physicists will read that stuff as they're flipping back to their research papers, because I think that's critically important. Now, in terms of how we get the word out beyond the world of science, I mean, you all know better about how to do that than I do, but my intuition is, and I'm looking at my friend Sean Joe here, who is an expert at doing this kind of thing, is that it's got to be in the community. It can't be on the internet just look at climate change and environmental racism. Those issues are different in every different place. How climate change affects Miami is different from how it affects St. Louis. And so you need a community-based strategy in both places and every other place. And so how do we have that, build that? It's not efficient. It's labor-intensive. But it's the kind of community-based work that you all are devoted to. And we need to partner with each other to get the messages through.
It's always political. My next question is related to that. What can we learn about presenting scientific findings in this era of deeply held populist anti-science views?
Yeah, so when we're presenting things to each other, it's going to be hard to change that very much, not change it very quickly. But when we're communicating it to the public, it's really time to think carefully about how that is done. One of the things that you hear said, which I disagree with, is every scientist should be a public communicator. Well, I'm sorry. That's you all study why that's a bad idea. And it's like I was saying earlier, I write things for other scientists. I don't write things for the local newspaper or to be shared in community-based research. And in my opinion, the handoff between the world of science and the world of science communication has not been adequate. And even the people who are good at it, who are selected by the government to do it, even they have left themselves open to manipulation. And so we need shrewd, highly skilled communicators that we are partnering with to get our message out in a very strategic way. And we don't really have that. And it's desperately needed. And part of the problem is that the researchers tend to look down on the people who are really good communicators. You know, there's a famous story that goes around science that Carl Sagan didn't get into the National Academy because people thought, you know, him explaining astronomy on television was, you know, cheapened his standing as a research scholar, okay? That is not an attractive feature of academia, that we have this, but it's very real. You know, my first administrative job at the university, which I enjoyed immensely, was running the planetarium that happened to be on the UNC campus. And, you know, it was great. I still have my lab, and I went over and helped, you know, school kids understand the solar system. And I learned a lot getting those kids off that bus and into that theater and how they reacted to things. But a lot of my research colleagues thought I was crazy to go do that. I did it because it was fun, but I also ended up learning a lot about sociology that I didn't know I was going to learn. You know, we need to celebrate. We need to celebrate everybody in our ecosystem, not just the people who get papers into our journals.
You know, the pandemic has really revealed, once again, as if we didn't, the inequities in many of our institutions, including education. Some estimate that the pandemic will have set us back with respect to the diversity in the scientific workforce. What's your perspective on this issue, and how do we prevent or protect ourselves from losing that movement of diversity in the scientific workforce, certainly in social science workforces as well?
Yeah, I'm deeply worried about this because, you know, like every other crisis, it magnifies whatever inequities were already there. So, you know, the first thing is, you know, we have to be comfortable saying we have racism and sexism and homophobia inside the world of science. You'd be surprised how many people can't do that. The data, to me, are obvious. But you hear all the time, oh, well, we just judge the science on its merits, and that's how we decide what gets in our journal. But that doesn't account for the differential opportunity that people have to produce science. You know, that's assuming everyone has the same opportunity to produce science, which means if you're a white male with 5 R01s at a big-time medical school, you're going to end up with a lot more papers in my journal than you are, you know, if you don't have all of those things going for you. And we've got a long way to go to break that down. You know, I've been in sessions where we've talked about how, you know, we're one of the few journals that collects demographic data on our authors and reviewers. And there are a lot of medical journals that say, oh, we would never do that, because that implies that, you know, that matters in the decision. And I'm thinking, what? So, you know, we do collect data, and we're doing a lot to try to analyze, and we'll be announcing some things about this in the next year or so, to give people on the outside the opportunity to analyze our data in terms of who reviews for us, who gets their papers in. We want everybody to know all that. We don't even know that stuff. So how are you going to solve the problem if you don't really have, you know, robust data to work from? So we're working to make our data anonymized and publicly available so that everybody can come study it. And I think that will make it harder for the people to say, oh, we don't have racism in medicine, or we don't have racism in science, to confront the fact that, you know, we really need to deal with the fact that not everybody has the same opportunity to produce a paper that gets into our journal. And until we've done that, you know, we're going to continue to have these problems, and that obtains again in tenure decisions and in who gets the faculty job to begin with, and who has the opportunity to thrive as a faculty member. And this is stuff where academia and the journals and lots of other people are going to have to work together much more aggressively than we have in the past.
Yeah. You know, we've talked a lot, and often do, about things like institutional racism, right? And the bias that institutions have. There have been some efforts to try to change that. I remember a day when I might be the only social worker at an NIH study section, or perhaps the only Latino, and Sean can, you know, tell us about, you know, the representation of others. But it really doesn't change. They might set up procedures, but ultimately, that person you described, the white guy with a 5R01 at the medical school, is listened to at the table in a way that's different. And despite the fact that our votes are equal, the voice at the table isn't, and that disadvantages people from Hispanic serving institutions, from HBCU, who have either are members of the study section or who are having their papers reviewed, simply not getting as fair a review as they should. That's a comment, not so much a question, but that's certainly been my experience, and I think we need to change that. And something about the institution, despite, you know, guidelines and new approaches to doing this, that, or the other, we're always returning to the default position, which is the difficulty when you're coming from an under-resourced school. Despite your brilliance, if you're coming from an under-resourced institution, the stronger institution always seems to prevail, and that's been my experience in study sections. Your thoughts on that?
No, well, the data are clear cut that you're correct. And you know, for example, the NIH sees the data and they say this is what they're going to do about it, but they refuse to alter their process. Well, the process was created to advantage people who look like me. It was created by people who look like me. So if you're not going to alter the process, then you're not going to break through these things. So as long as you're basically marrying rhetoric with a racist process, the process is going to win every single time. And it's the same thing with hiring committees and universities, and you know, all of these things were devised when European males were the only people in higher education, and also the way we teach science was designed then. And we know that lecturing and droning on and writing with big chalk on the blackboard is a good way to select for wealth and societal advantages. So we have to change the process, and the NIH has refused to do that. I think Francis Collins was the best NIH director of my lifetime, no question. He was brilliant at talking to people from both sides. He also confronted the most challenges. And on this, he just couldn't quite bring himself to blow up the system. And if you don't, if you have the same study sections and the same people and the same way of judging everything, then you're going to get the same result. And This audience doesn't need me to tell you that. You all are better experts at that than I am. But we have a lot of people who don't have the courage to say that, that's the situation that we have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have lots of questions, Shenyang and I do, but I also want to be able to open it up to members of the audience if you have questions for Dr. Thorp. But Shenyang didn't. No, go. Oh. I'm sorry, I thought there were mics out there, but you can certainly borrow one of ours.
Here you go, Sean. Pass it around.
Yeah, we can use. There's a question, a hand over there.
Right here.
Thank you.
This is a real treat, and thank you so much for organizing this symposium. It's a great panel and something I've been thinking about. And a few years ago, I came across the book, Don't Be Such a Scientist, and it kind of prompted me to start thinking about some of these types of things in terms of the outward-facing piece of science. What my question is I run a large statewide epidemiological survey on substance use and other risk behaviors, and in the first week of its administration, I have had more politically motivated parental calls opting their children out of participation than we've ever seen. So I've had to talk to my staff about how to address these, and it's interesting because it is, one piece is the human subjects level. You have to deal with, addressing them as research participants with full rights to informed consent and the decision to consent their child into the study. But then we're also getting threats and we're getting expletives directed at us for basically implementing a survey. So I'm curious, on the ground or in the field, if you have any thoughts on communicating with, two questions. To what extent do you think there's going to be a shift, particularly with school-based research, and the politics affecting research? And then second is, if for those of us that are in the field doing this type of work, how do we talk to individuals that don't believe in what we're doing or don't trust our motives?
Yeah, so on the second one, I'm the wrong guy to talk to. I talk to scientists all day long, but I think the people that I talk to who do know these things, one of the, so for example, the best predictor of whether someone you might not expect to get vaccinated has gotten vaccinated is whether they knew anything about vaccines before the pandemic, right? So if you're trying to explain vaccines at the same time you're trying to overcome the political hurdle, that's probably too many hurdles to overcome at once. So we need a community-based strategy for getting this to people, and we can't expect to explain everything all at once. When somebody asks me a scientific question, I want to say, okay, well, 14.6 billion years ago, there was this big explosion, and we know that because we can measure the cosmic microwave background, and we know, nobody wants to hear all that. They want to hear, how does it affect them? And, I used in an editorial recently, the success on anti-smoking. Well, the thing that turned the corner on anti-smoking was, the ads of people who had lost their teeth and whose lives had been destroyed by smoking, talking to other smokers, not what nicotine does chemically in your lungs. And so, I think really skilled public health folks are the right people to be doing that kind of thing, not the molecular folks. As to the first part of your question, I'm really worried about political intrusion into higher education. I was in a red state. Well, I ran a university in a state where I started off with a Democratic state government and it switched to a Republican state government while I was there. Then I went to a private university. I mean, the difference in terms of what we could do and say was just stunning. I mean, I remember, I had a hard time. In fact, the legislature passed a law saying I couldn't do it when I was in North Carolina, getting gender-neutral housing. Then I got to WashU, and turned out we had gender-neutral housing for juniors and seniors, but not for first-year and sophomore students. The students came to me and said, "Can we have this?" And I'm like, "Oh no, I got to go to not do this again. I'm going to get shot down for this." So I go into the chancellor and I say, "The students want gender-neutral housing on the South 40," and he goes, "Oh, we don't have it yet?" And I said, "No." Okay, so that's not fair. If you're at the University of Texas or you're at Washington University in St. Louis, you're living in two different worlds. And if we can't have an honest telling of the history of the United States when it comes to the Native American genocide and slavery, I mean, how are we going to do anything? I mean, our job is to find the truth. If we can't explain basic facts about American history, then it's only a matter of time before we can't explain basic facts about immunology. So, I'm very worried about that, both for higher education as a whole and also for the gap that exists between the well-resourced private institutions and the publics and the HBCUs and the regional publics that are out there being the main ones who are moving people into opportunity with education. So if you have the schools that are lifting people up being the ones that have a hard time telling the truth, that's a double whammy. Yeah.
I want to jump in on this for a second because Holden's always lifting up the headwinds that are either here or emerging. So now there's an effort, well, what do you think the growing role of private higher education institutions are going to play, or these groups who are getting together under a new narrative to express a very focused political purposes? I'm trying to remember the name of the group that's starting this new university of all these major higher education leaders. Let me get back to the point. The role of the for-profit higher education institutions that is growing, and the pandemic has given them some more strength. It's because most things have gone online, where most of their educational approaches was online. So I just want to know what you think about that. And then what do you foresee as the other headwinds that we will be challenged by? Because you have a unique perspective of managing things from a campus point of view and now from a publication point of view. So I would love to get your insight on that.
Yeah, so as far as for-profit higher education is concerned, we had done a pretty good job of beating them down. The Obama administration did a lot of work on it. Most of them were going under or doing mergers and things. And then the pandemic came along and the Trump administration at the same time, and that's given them some new life, and that worries me. For people to get degrees that aren't advancing their worldview and perhaps taking their money to train them for something that isn't necessarily going to provide an economic benefit that's consistent with what they paid for it. So that's very worrisome. I spent most of my career in administration trying to give away as much health care and education as I could. And the for-profit schools are not doing that. So that's certainly a worry and things we need to fight against. In terms of the headwinds, well, I think there's no greater headwind than the intrusion of politics into higher education. Of course, it's always been political, but, having run the University of North Carolina with half the time with one party, half the time with the other, the Democrats sometimes wanted me to do things that I didn't really want to do. Various social projects or things that would have been better done not by the university. But the university was an entity that had the infrastructure and capability that they could rely on, so they were constantly giving me things to do that weren't really in research and education, and I went and tried to do them anyway because I didn't have any choice. That's not great, but it's certainly not doing huge harm. Then when you have a Republican government, they're trying to get you to stop doing things that you do want to do. And of course, that's way worse. And that's the world that a lot of these universities are living in right now. I do also think that the demographic headwinds are going to be significant. More people of color are coming to higher education, more income disparity among the students, and the universities are behind on addressing that. And the rate at which it's getting fixed is not as great as the rate at which these differences are coming to us. And then finally, I think the mental health crisis in higher education is serious and not being addressed properly. You go to the trustees meeting, the student comes and says, some students come and say, I couldn't get an appointment at the counseling center. I waited 6 months or whatever, and the trustees tell the university to hire more counselors. There aren't more counselors to hire in the first place, and even if they did, that's not a systemic solution to the problem. People in your line of work need to go tell the universities how to address this. It's not about just hiring more counselors. It can't be, because it's not going to scale. And so, being sophisticated about addressing the mental health challenges in 18 to 30-year-old people is something that the universities are going to have to get a whole lot better at very fast.
Thank you. I will let our audience ask questions, but I do have an important question many of us are interested, which is about preprints.
Yeah.
Preprints have become increasingly popular and common in posting research findings on websites before they get peer-reviewed and published in academic journals. How do you see this trend, both now and after the pandemic?
Yeah, so for us, we basically love preprints because in the pandemic, for example, it has given other scientists a way to see data while we're doing everything that we have to do the peer review and make sure that all the right data get posted and that it's secure on the internet. And it turns out maintaining a robust scientific record is an expensive and time-consuming thing to do. We take it for granted that the papers are always going to be there. The links to the Zenodo site with the underlying data are going to be are not going to be broken. If there's a correction or a retraction, that it's going to be done. These are all, that it's going to look beautiful on the website when I go to look at it. These are all complicated tasks. We get a lot of people saying, can you change this on our website? Can you change this on your website? I'm like, it's not Facebook. You don't just click what's on my mind and type your paper. It has to be very rigorously maintained. The fact that preprints can be used as a way to accelerate information getting out while all of that is being done is good in every respect. But it's like a lot of these other things, it's no different than scientists debating things on Twitter. Okay, to me that's mostly good because it accelerates scientific progress. But sometimes the other side, the people who want to undermine us, can grab our arguments and say, see, even these people don't agree about this, so they obviously don't know what they're doing. And preprints the same way. And you could put something really destructive up in a preprint, and it might get taken down if it's really bad, but it takes a while for that to happen, and a lot of damage can get done. I mean, a lot of the misinformation about myocarditis and the vaccines was enhanced by putting up sketchy preprints that took us a while to get taken down. And you could send a paper to a bunch of peer-reviewed journals, it all gets rejected, and then you can post it as a preprint. The scientific community knows how to process this. The public does not. So it gets to this complicated question of when do we do things to accelerate science, and when do we do things, and what happens if some of those things can be exploited by people who want to undermine science. And you could have a whole panel on people who would debate that back and forth. But generally, if the question is, does it change whether your paper is going to get accepted by science if you publish a preprint? The answer is no. We encourage preprints. We're happy for people to do it. The astronomers were doing it for decades, and it didn't change anything about when you could get your peer-reviewed astronomy paper published, and now that's spread to the rest of science, and that's a good thing.
Great. Let's move to the session for Q&A to our audience. And before you raise your question, please tell us your name and your affiliation.
Thank you for this symposium. It's been really helpful. I feel like you guys have verbalized a lot of what's been on my mind, especially this past year because of COVID. My name is Alan. I'm a student, a doc student at the University of Texas at Arlington. So my question would be, what would be your advice for new scholars? So doc students that will be graduating soon. It is very, so like I said, this has been on my mind a lot, how it's become so political and a little hostile at times, like we've heard some from people here, especially on social media. With the COVID vaccine and everything has become so polarized that, even one post pro-vaccine or pro-mask can make your family or your own friends come against you because they're so opposed to it. So what would be your advice for new scholars that are going out in the field? And do you feel like there's something we can do to use these new tools like social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, to help promote science in a way that won't just be a hostile debate, but we can respectfully promote science while avoiding just arguments and ongoing discussions that don't really get us anywhere, and people just keep commenting and maybe being hostile about it? What would be your advice with those things?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask. Probably better to ask somebody who's actually been subject to that kind of thing much more than I have. I mean, I do get hate mail and I do get trolled on Twitter, but I have tenure at a rich university, and I'm 57 years old, and I'm the editor of Science, and I've had a lot of unfair advantages in my life, and so I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask, but I think that we try to cover in the magazine, the front part of the magazine, these issues a lot with voices from other young scholars, and so I think trying to learn from each other is probably better than old guys giving advice, because it's a lot easier for us. But I think trying to go places where in your career where the senior faculty recognize the big changes that have happened compared to when we were in graduate school and now is critically important, because as we were talking about with the funding levels and all that stuff, a lot of these problems come about from people my age thinking that things for all of you are the same as they were for us, and they weren't. They're not. And that's something that we need to be able to talk about openly. But thank you for being willing to get out there and seek the truth in this crazy world that we're all in.
Well, While we wait for the
Yeah.
audience, there was a, I think Sean Joe's question about, you know, these new upstart universities. We have one in Austin, Texas, the University of Austin, which is not the University of Texas at Austin. But it's intended really as a response to the so-called liberal bias of that university, of University of Texas. And I think we're going to see more of that. We've seen governors appointing trustees, regents, and even right down to the president, political appointees in public universities. That creates this bifurcation, right? We have the public universities are subject to that, and then the privates, where the chancellor can say, oh, we're not doing that already,
Yeah.
let's move on it. What's that future going to look like in your mind, especially with respect to you know, science and social justice?
Yeah. Well, we're in a tough situation. So as far as the University of Austin is concerned, I was very mad at them because they announced it on a weekday, and my tweet was, why don't you guys announce this on a Saturday when I have more time to write jokes? Because I really could have come up with a lot of great material about that. Yeah, it turns out snark is the way to get a lot of Twitter followers. I know everybody knows that. That was a golden opportunity, and I was busy that day, so I didn't really get to in on it as much as I would have enjoyed doing. Yeah, I mean, of course, that whole thing is silly. But I think the situation we have, which I find to be quite interesting, is that for some reason, I mean, it happens because it polls well politically for them to do this. It's kind of absurd when you think about it because, for example, those of you who came here on an airplane, your pilot almost certainly was extremely conservative. Pilots, you know, are politically conservative. They come from the military, and you know, there's all kinds of factors. None of you got on the plane, went up to the cockpit, and said, "I'm sorry, I don't agree with you about politics, so I don't want you to fly my airplane. I don't trust you to fly it. I don't care about the politics of my pilot." But yet, in higher education, we say, well, we don't trust you to seek the truth because we don't agree with you about politics. I mean, that's absurd on the face of it. If we have a country where half the people are liberal and half the people are conservative, so guess what? We're going to have some industries that skew one way or the other. There's no way around that. But the substantive argument doesn't get you very far because it polls well politically for them to attack us. And it's like I said earlier, if we aren't free to speak and write the truth about the history of the country or the status of the country or about scientific issues, then you know we're going to be in big trouble. And it's to our opponent's political advantage to stop us from doing that because most people, for example, if they, you know, there are persuadable people out there that if you actually explain the history of the country to them, they'll go, oh yeah, I didn't know all that. You know, just walk around and look at the buildings here in Washington, you know. There's a lot more behind the George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln than you get from walking around the monuments. And we've got to tell those stories. And if we don't get to, then you know we're not going to have a democracy. And a lot of people are worried that we already don't have one or are close to losing it. So I don't know if I have any uplifting thoughts about that, but I agree with everybody who is worried.
There's a question in the back.
I'll repeat Sean's question. I can hear him.
The other side of this is the concern that traditional higher
Yeah.
So we have these two different headwinds happening at the same time.
Right, so Sean's,
Could you repeat it?
yeah, go ahead.
So the other side of the conversation is whether or not our current higher education institutions are producing the right level of skills development for those who are coming through our doors. So you have these two competing trends, or two trends working in parallel that might lead to more of this idea of these alternative institutions with much more putatively open, academic environments. But we've seen this before. That's how we ended up with conservative news and mainstream news. So it's a similar playbook. Now we're trying to say the same thing with higher education. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, look, even in the progressive universities like the one that you and Shenyang and I are all affiliated with, for example, undergraduate business education is something that gets done. Now, it's hilarious in a way that I ran two schools that are two of the top undergraduate business degree schools. My personal belief is that an undergraduate business degree is just not a useful thing in any respect. And we shouldn't have undergraduate business degrees, but business is the most common major across all of higher education. And so we're not giving undergraduates a liberal arts education that allows them to develop a sophisticated worldview that enhances democracy. And in the sciences, we have severe problems because engineering especially, but also chemistry, there are these professional societies that stack up all these requirements that are good for employing science faculty, because you have to teach all this stuff, but they're crowding out everything about the world with equations and more courses on mass transport or whatever. And that's true even at progressive private universities, and it's even worse at the publics where Luis's president gets dragged in all the time to make presentations about, the employment prospects of the undergraduates, which are put ahead of whether they are able to generate a worldview that is enhancing for society.
Because of the time, let's have the very last question.
Yes, one more question.
Yep, she's...
Hi, my name is Woo Jin Jung, and I am an assistant professor at Rutgers University. Thank you so much for this informative session. I have a question about transparency and replicability of social science, which is related to, this topic. Regarding my study, I try to replicate some of the studies from science and nature. And I don't know whether data is available, but data was, in the first place, was not available. And so I had to download data on my own. And then also in terms of script, only 10% of script was, publicly available. So the rest, I had to fill the gap. And even after that, I, see what, some of the, algorithm was, made and ad hoc based. So there are a lot of discretionary decisions in the script. So there was, the entire process of replicating the study was challenging. And I was just wondering what percentage of science or nature paper could be replicable and verifiable by other academic community, and would there be a process or platform that could facilitate this transparency?
Yeah. So this is where we put a lot of our time and effort and money. Like I said earlier, the scientific record has to be maintained. And it's a labor-intensive process to do that because every paper that somebody has questions about, a human being who is enough of an expert to analyze the situation has to go through and figure out whether the concerns that are being raised are valid and whether we need to do something to correct the paper or not. We retract, for science, we retract somewhere between 3 and 5 papers a year. Is that all of the ones that deserve to be retracted? Probably not. But people say, you know, do you worry about having that many retractions? And I say, well, no, I would be worried if we had 0. Because, you know, human beings are fallible and subject to motivated reasoning, and to imagine that you're going to publish 700 papers every year and every one of them is perfect is a ridiculous assumption. So the fact that we have 3 to 5 retractions is reassuring that science is honorably self-correcting. As far as how to make them more reproducible, what you're saying is exactly the thing we have to do. We have to be relentless about making sure that everything that somebody would need to reproduce a study is posted somewhere. And this has changed a lot during the time that I've been in science. When I began as a young faculty member, the only thing that went in supporting information was if you had a X-ray crystal structure in your paper. But there was nothing else in supporting information. Of course, we were doing it all on paper then, and now there's the supplement is much, much longer than the paper, and then there are links to data sets and all of that. But we're always finding new ways that we never thought of to deposit more of the data. It's peeling an onion. There's an artifact that's only in a museum, or there's a sample, but when you do the experiment, you destroy it, and then there's not another one because it's a moon rock or something like that. There's sociological data that are different when you collect them in different ways, in different places, and so there's always a new frontier in terms of what needs to be posted and curated by the journal in order to create a scientific record that makes life easier for you to do this kind of work. And so we're always learning and happy to hear from people when we need to do more. And frankly, thanking. None of us like to there are certain whistleblowers out there who examine a lot of papers. We don't enjoy hearing from them, but they're often correct. And when they are, we need to thank them. But unfortunately, not all. There are a lot of PIs out there who won't engage with the whistleblowers. So one sociological impediment we have is there are a lot of highly resourced, prominent investigators who won't engage with us when we say, we heard from this person about something that's wrong with your paper. And that reinforces a lot of the inequities that are already there, because those are people who feel like they're powerful enough that they don't have to engage. And that's a big challenge in academia that we all need to work on.
Thank you. I will let President Zayas give the conclusive remarks. But I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Holden Thorp and Dr. Luis Zayas, for your wonderful dialogue and your perspectives and insightful thinking. And thank you, our social worker researchers, for your participation.
This was so much fun. Thank you all for including me.
Yes, thank you all very much for coming in. This is a great moment. This is an unusual sort of panel. I think we need to do more of it where we can go beyond social work, but get to science, which is what has driven us all to a conference such as this one. So thank you all very much. Continue to work hard and be out there bold in your inquiries. Thank you so much.